Cool. Hello, everyone. This is crooked. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. Today we're doing a Vietnamese dish called a Vietnamese dish that relies very heavily on the use of vermicelli noodles. The recipe that we're following is going to be based off of a recipe that came out over on my YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago. With the original recipe that we did, it uses grilled chicken. Today we're going to be doing it with grilled tofu, which is a pretty common substitute, especially here in the States. You find it a lot. Usually you'll find it right next to each other, and it's generally like the main vegetarian option that you find at a lot of like Vietnamese restaurants, at least here in California. So we're going to be running through a bunch of different stuff. Probably the main thing that we're going to be doing, like the biggest part of what we're doing today, is going to be that lemongrass, which is pretty challenging to work with if you've never worked with lemongrass before. So we're going to dive into all of that stuff. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. As always, if you're looking for the recipe videos, those always live over on my YouTube channel. So generally, if you see something that's being streamed live here, you'll probably be able to find the recipe for the thing that we're cooking that lives over on the YouTube channel. Because almost always when we're cooking something, it's probably something that has already come out as a recipe video. So this particular lemongrass vermicelli, it came out on the YouTube channel. I think that was back in maybe in July or so, couple of months ago. So that's over there already. So if you're looking for that stuff, definitely make your way over to the YouTube channel and check out what's going on over there. We're working our way up to 5,500 subscribers by the end of the month. Our previous goal was 5,000, and we actually just hit it, I think last night. So all that stuff and more living over on the YouTube channel. So definitely hop over there if you haven't checked it out yet. That's also where our second live stream lives. So this laptop behind me, that's where that's going. So I've been told that the camera comes out better, and also like it views in landscape a little bit better. So if that's your thing, check it out. Cool. So as with a lot of our dishes, we're starting out with a couple of cloves of garlic. You'll notice that I'm crushing more than a couple of cloves. This is almost half a head. I think this is about half a head of garlic here, or what I like to say is about 8 cloves. The reason that I'm crushing so much garlic right now is because it goes in 2 different places. So what you'll find that we're about to do is there's actually only one thing that actually gets cooked in what we're doing today. The rest of it is just fresh ingredients, which is why the other most important thing that we want to talk about today is that everything that you use, it's got to be really, really fresh. It's probably something that you want to have bought at the market like today, or like at the very least this week. Because almost everything that we're going to be eating is not going to be cooked. It's just you're just going to be eating it raw, which means that if it's like kind of spoiled, or if it's like questionable but you're okay with eating it anyway, you're probably going to know, because it's not going to have benefited from like a wok cook or any kind of like heavy cooking. So everything except for 2 of the ingredients that we're using today, they're going to be things that I bought at the market today. The rest of the stuff, so the things that are not fresh, are the cucumbers, and I think the carrots are not fresh, but they're like about a couple of days old. So all of that stuff we're going to take a look at, and how important it is to make sure that you have fresh ingredients. So first up, the reason that we're chopping up, this is 4 cloves of garlic here. The reason that I'm chopping up 8 cloves is because it's going to go in 2 different places. The first place is going to go into our marinade. The second place is going to go into our sauce base. So first I'm going to start by setting all of this aside. So this is 4. It's like 4-ish. So I'm going to start by setting all of this aside. Let's start small. and setting all of this aside and dividing it in half so that we know which one can go where. The other thing that I also wanted to point out, so if you notice that your garlic starts sprouting like this, so these little cloves like this started happening in mine. That's not the end of the world. What I like to do is just give it a good crush and then pick out that sprout. The sprout can give you a little bit of indigestion if you don't remember to take it out. I've also forgotten to take it out before, and it's not the end of the world either. So lots of people start throwing out their garlic when that happens, but you don't need to do that. So here's our second set of garlic, which I'm crushing and mincing. Then we're going to set this second set aside. This is going to be for our sauce base. Both of these, by the way, are not going to be cooked, which, just like I mentioned, anytime that we're using our garlic for anything that's not going to be cooked in a wok fry. So we want to be a little bit more particular about how well we go through and do that chopping, because if it's not chopped correctly or if it's not chopped thoroughly, it's going to pop out, because generally when it's going into a wok fry, you're going to be okay if you maybe take some shortcuts on it or like skip a couple of steps, because for the most part, you're just going to end up combining all that stuff anyway, and it's all going to go into a wok. But for today's particular version, though, we definitely want to make sure that that stuff gets nice and chopped up. Otherwise, it's for sure going to pop out because we're going to be eating it raw. All right, next up, this is some tofu. So if you're following the original recipe, we used chicken thigh, which is probably the most common thing. Today I'm using, actually probably the most common is pork. But today we're using some tofu because this is what I have. And what we're going to do is chop it in some relatively large blocks here. So we're going to keep these pretty large, so generally you'll notice that I usually would dice this stuff a little bit smaller. But today we're going to keep it pretty large, particularly for the reason that we're going to be grilling it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw this all into a Ziploc bag. So we're going to skip our bowl today. And this is all going straight into a Ziploc bag. Which, if you've never marinated stuff in a Ziploc, you should definitely do that because it's a great shortcut. Cool. So next up, we're going to get working on our marinade, which starts off most prominently with our lemongrass, which if you've never found lemongrass before, you probably won't see it looking like this. It will usually be a lot longer. The lemongrass that I'm using today comes from a market down the street, which does a handy job of chopping this stuff in half for us because it's a lot easier to store if you make sure and chop it in half first. So the tricky part about lemongrass is that most of the lemongrass is not edible. So what we want to do before we dive into our lemongrass, woohoo, yeah, thank you, hello. What we want to do when we dive into our lemongrass, first off, chop off the parts that don't look great. But then what we want to do is first slice it in half, which can be difficult if you don't have a sharp knife, so make sure that you're nice and sharp. And then inside of here, once we dive past all of this rough exterior stuff, so this stuff that's really chewy and dense, once you dive past those first couple of layers, then you get into this nice tender bit. This is the part that we want, so this part right here. The rest of this stuff, you could probably keep it. You could keep some of it. I happen to have a lot of lemongrass that's probably going to go bad, so I'm going to throw out most of it because a lot of this lemongrass is about to spoil. So here's our rough exterior. I'm going to slice it in half, and then we're going to get rid of this exterior layer. And this tender interior, that's the part that we're looking for here. Let's do one more. We got in some shallots. I forgot to buy shallots. Yeah, I forgot to buy shallots. I also forgot to buy cilantro. This is my bad. We're gonna have to do it without shallots. Actually, I have a red onion. Maybe I'll use some red onion. Yeah, maybe. I'll think about it. That's not really the same thing. I forgot to buy shallots. I'm pretty sure in the original recipe, though, I did use a whole bunch of shallots. But here we are. I don't have shallots today. So by far, probably the most important ingredient in what we're cooking today, it's in the name, is our lemongrass. That's because it's going to be the source of pretty much all of the main source of flavor of what we're cooking today. So it's super, super important when we go to do our marinade that we don't want to skip any steps. It's also the reason why I'm doing the marinade very, very first, is because we want to make sure that we give our marinade as much time as possible to really like infuse with our protein, which is going to be our tofu today. If you take shortcuts on that part, lots of times you'll see me. I will take shortcuts on our marinade. Maybe only give it like maybe 10-15 minutes or so. Today in particular, we don't want to take any shortcuts because if we skip steps here, we're going to lose all of the flavors. So here's our lemongrass. I just gave it a little bit of a crush to get those the aromatics kind of releasing there, and then we're setting that aside. All right, next up, we're going to dive into the liquids of our marinade. Starting things off, I'm going to start off with, this is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Followed by 4 tablespoons of fish sauce. Fish sauce, by the way, may be one of the most common ingredients in Vietnamese food. And it's going to be where all of our fishy umami comes from, and maybe like a lot of where a lot of our sugars are going to come from too. Next up, I think I'm going to save half of this lime. Oh, you know what? There's another half in the fridge. Next up, this is going to be half of a lime. This is a very juicy lime, though, so I'm probably only going to use some of it. Ooh, thoughts on basil for pesto? Yeah, technically you can make pesto out of anything. Pesto is really just a ground-up veggie. I've seen like kale pestos, but yeah, definitely if you're making pesto, basil is probably the best choice. Although I am not an expert on Italian food, so don't quote me on that stuff. By far the least experienced cuisine I have is Italian. Next up, this is 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, which feels like a lot because we just added a quarter cup of fish sauce, which is already in itself quite a bit of sugar. But I actually think that it calls for just for the sake of the marinade, which is going to be really useful. And then last up, we're going to add our garlic here. That is it, yeah. Delivery to the East Coast, yeah. Soon. So that's our marinade. I'm going to give this a good toss. We, again, want to be careful since we're using tofu here to not break up that tofu. If you're too aggressive with the way that you toss things right now, you're going to start crumbling that tofu. So anytime that you're using tofu, even if you're using firm tofu like we are today, we want to be careful to make sure that we don't break that stuff up. So there's our marinade. I'm going to set this all aside. What we want for this is for it to go for at least 30 minutes, up to an hour. A lot of times you hear me say up to 30 minutes, up to an hour, and maybe skip or dive in around 15 minutes and just like not really care too much about the length of your marinade. Today it's actually super, super important because the majority of what we're looking for, so the big flavors that we're looking for today, it's coming from that lemongrass, and that lemongrass, it only releases in the marinade. So it's the only source of that lemongrass is coming from that marinade. So today, and specifically today, it's very important for the marinade to actually get its full 30 minutes in that bag. New haircut, yeah, new haircut. I cut my hair myself. I did. Thank you. Thank you for noticing. Cool. So meanwhile, I'm going to set the timer and make sure that we go for 30 minutes. Meanwhile, we're going to dive into our veggies next. So everything else, other than that tofu, everything else that we're going to cook today is all raw. So we're not cooking anything else. Literally, the only thing that we're cooking today is going to be our tofu. So for our carrots, the first thing that I want to do, what I do generally for almost any time that I eat carrots, first thing I like to do is cut off this little tapered off end. I find that the carrot tends to get a little bit more bitter there, and also helps us peel a little bit better. So I like to cut that end off, and then what we're going to do is make sure that our carrot is rooted on the bottom here. And then go for our peel. So lots of people ask me, how do I peel so fast? Not all of it is practice. A lot of it is just technique. So as long as our carrot is rooted on the cutting board, then we can spin. And also helps to have your sink right there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, new haircut. Cool, so here's our carrot. I'm gonna split this in, I wanna say quarters or so. First thing that I do anytime that I cut carrots, you'll notice, I do this pretty much anytime that I'm working with carrots, is I start arranging them by size. So here's our largest carrot here. These are our two largest. And then they are going down in size, so this being our smallest carrot. So it's super annoying. So the reason that I do that is so that we can pay attention to how small or how large we need to chop our carrot. So I'm starting off with my smallest carrot here, and what we're going to do is go for our julienne cut here, which is a lot easier to do once we have a good idea of like how we're prioritizing our chops. So I found that's a super important step to make sure to take into consideration with veggies like carrots, because they taper off and they're like a little bit odd in size. So if you're not paying attention and you don't address that difference in size, you'll end up with uneven chops. An uneven chop is super terrible thing to have to come across when you're biting into, say, like a raw piece of carrot and one of that carrot is much larger or much smaller. It's very tragic. So cool. So we're gonna do our julienne cut here. So what we're doing, I just sliced it in half, and then we're going with slices down the center here, which I like to do with just the tip of the knife, and then we're slanting it on its side and then chopping down. So one more time, slices down the center, just the tip of the knife. This is going to help us make sure that that carrot stays together as we chop. And then flipping it on its side and chopping down. The julienne cut, definitely an intimidating chop because it's probably one of the more labor-intensive ones. If you want, you can also get out a microplane and start grating this stuff. Well, probably not a microplane, but I think you could do it with a food processor. He doesn't care at all. I do care. I'll carrot a lot. That's a good one. All right. Cool. Yeah. All right, so once again, there's our slices down the center. Then we're flipping it on its side so they're essentially stacked on top. And then once they're stacked on top of each other, we can just chop downward. Very important to have a good claw technique for your julienne cuts, because if you don't, you can definitely cut yourself. Yeah. You're late, but you're starting from the beginning. Yeah, you could definitely do that. Hello to everyone just tuning in, by the way. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If you're just now tuning in, today we're doing a lemongrass chicken vermicelli. Actually, we're doing it with tofu today, not lemongrass chicken. So we're doing a grilled lemongrass vermicelli, though. Today we're doing it with some soft tofu. For those following along, what we're cooking, as with pretty much anything that we cook on stream, it lives as a recipe over on my YouTube channel. They always do. That recipe, I think it came out a couple of months ago. It's over on the channel already. And in that original recipe, we did this with chicken thigh, I believe. Today we're going to be doing it with some firm tofu and kind of demonstrating how to essentially make this dish a vegetarian dish. It's not quite vegetarian because it technically contains fish sauce, but... for most folks, that's generally enough, I think. All right, so next up, as we get into the larger bits of carrot, the reason that I started by sorting these by sizes so that we can start paying attention more closely when we get to these larger carrots, because we need to slice them a little bit more thinly because they're so much larger. So here they are on their sides. And we're chopping down. Cool. So there's our planks. At that point, you could probably stop there and you could call that a plank, which sometimes I do if I'm feeling super lazy, but I actually think the julienne cut is going to be super important today. Yeah. This, by the way, is by far the most laborious part of what we're cooking or doing today. So there's our planks, once again, then we're flipping on it on its side and chopping down. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh, you're just getting into cooking. That's awesome. Yeah. Glad that I can inspire some folks to cook for themselves. Hopefully people cook themselves. All right, one more time. Here's our last bit of julienne chopping. Alright. So, there's our carrots. That was a lot of carrots. This might actually be too much carrot. We'll find out. This might be too much carrot. I guess we'll find out. Alright, next up we're going to do the same thing. This is with some cucumber, which is meat only. I wouldn't say this is not fresh, but it's, I think it's maybe 2 days old. So we're going to do, this is going to be a very similar julienne cut with our carrots, but we're going to do it a little bit differently because our carrots, they contain seeds in it, which we want to address when we do things like a julienne cut, because these seeds that are in here, all of this stuff, we don't want that to end up in our slices of carrot or cucumber because I find at least that they get a little bit mushy. So what I like to do is I like to chop them into quarters and start by removing those seeds first. And that just prevents our cucumbers from sort of like julienne cutting into like a really, really mushy cucumber. It's technically optional. You can absolutely leave those in if you want, but I find that it benefits the texture of the cucumber quite a bit. So just like we did with our carrot, we're going with slices down the center with the tip of our knife, then chopping downward. One more time, slices down the center. Then Last one, here's our slices down the center. Flipping it on its side, and then we're chopping downward. And there's our carrots. Cucumbers. We call them carrots. Alright, so we're going to set all of that aside and dive into our lettuce next. So in the original recipe, we used buttered lettuce, which I think is probably the most traditional stuff to use. Today we're going to be doing this with a bit of romaine lettuce instead. In that original recipe, I also didn't chop the lettuce, which wasn't the end of the world, but I actually found that it was a little bit harder to eat. It looked prettier. That's the reason that I didn't chop it, is because it looked a lot prettier, because it had this nice bouquet of lettuce sort of popping out. But because you're eating it in a bowl with chopsticks, it actually makes it really difficult to eat. And I discovered also the reason why in most restaurants they chop that stuff up for you, otherwise it's really hard to eat. So for our lettuce, I'm starting off by first give it a good rinse. Especially with any kind of like heads of lettuce. So if it's not pre-chopped, you definitely want to give that lettuce a real good rinse, because for the most part, because it's coming right out of the ground, it will have a lot of bugs in it, which I find pretty much any time that I eat romaine lettuce in particular. I find bugs in almost every bouquet. So we definitely want to make sure you don't have to use fruit wash. Sometimes I use fruit wash today in particular. I'm probably going to use a little bit of fruit wash, but more importantly is we want, before you start chopping, make sure to give that stuff a real good rinse, otherwise you're probably going to come across some bugs in your lettuce, which is not super attractive. Then what we're doing here, I'm just chopping super thinly. Lettuce, by the way, because it is leafy, if you don't bunch it up properly, we want to make sure that we roll these leafy bits together. Same way that we chop spices. If you don't roll it tightly, you're not going to chop all the way through. Your knife will hit the cutting board without actually cutting through the lettuce. And then you're going to have like stringy bits of lettuce, which we don't want. So when we get to these leafier parts of our lettuce, we're coiling it really, really tightly. And that's going to sort of help us make sure that we chop all the way through it. We do a similar thing anytime that we chop like any kind of spices. So when we're chopping basil, if we're chopping spinach, stuff like that, we want to have that stuff wrapped real tightly. Otherwise it won't pop up or cut through all the way, which I think happened here. Here's a good now. Almost. So there's our lettuce. Next up, this is some bean sprouts, which I'm going to wash up. Not much to do with those bean sprouts other than just give it a good wash. That's going to be about it. Not quite as important with the lettuce as with the lettuce to make sure that we wash this stuff super thoroughly, because you generally won't find too many bugs in those bean sprouts. But I still like to at least give it a good rinse, if not a good wash. Probably should open this better. Bean sprouts, by the way, if you have never used bean sprouts before, are super perishable. So generally, when I buy bean sprouts, I try and use as much of it as possible in the first day that I buy it, because it's probably going to spoil before I can finish using it. So I don't think I've ever eaten an entire bag of bean sprouts before, just because of how fast that they spoil. Other real cool thing that we can talk about bean sprouts is that a bean sprout, at the top of the bean, is a mung bean. So that's this stuff. Most of the time when you come across bean sprouts, lots of times you'll see the sprout or the bean at the top of the sprout. That's where this goes. Most of the time they pick it off, or sometimes they'll pick it before it starts sprouting. So what we want are these nice long bits of bean sprouts. So there's our bean sprouts. Is that it? I think that's it. I think that's it. All right, next up what we're going to do is our sauce element. So most of the time, if you've ever come across lemongrass vermicelli in a restaurant, it's generally served with a sauce base that comes on the side. I actually always assumed that was just fish sauce, like just straight up fish sauce coming from the bottle, but it is actually a lot more than just fish sauce, which we are going to dive into. In Vietnamese, you call that the nuc chom, which is essentially a sauce base. It is mostly made up of fish sauce, but it's also made up of a number of other things. So we're going to take a look at all of that. Starting off first, that's my garlic. And then what we're going to do is our heat elements next. So this is going to be not done chopping. Next up, this is a couple of Thai chilies. So I'm only using 3. In the original recipe, I think I used 6, which was very spicy. We want to temper the amount of Thai chilies that we use here based off of how hot do you want the sauce to be. If you don't like spice at all, you can totally leave these out. I actually do think that the Thai chilies add a nice bit of flavor. So I highly encourage you to include at least one of them because the capsaicin from the chili is a nice bit of spice. But if you don't like heat, definitely tailor this number up or down. Today we're using 3, which is a very moderate amount of spice. The other thing to keep in mind is that since we're not cooking these Thai chilies, that means that they're not really going to reduce very much. So lots of times you'll cook off a little bit of the heat that comes from those Thai chilies. Today, this is going into our sauce raw, which means that all of that heat is going straight into the sauce. Also, the last thing that I like to do when I work with Thai chilies is pick out the ones that have the prettiest colors. So I usually, when I buy them at the market, I'll look for the ones that have the most like bright and colorful chilies involved. Next up, this is the rest of my lime, which is about half of a lime. That's a very juicy lime. Then next up, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. Again, also kind of feels like a lot of sugar because that fish sauce already has quite a bit of sugar, but this sugar element is going to be really, really important. It's also the same reason why we want to include that lime in order to make sure that it offsets how much sugar that we're adding here. Next up, this is going to be 4 tablespoons of fish sauce. Followed by a 1/4 cup of water. Am I missing anything? That is it. So I'm going to give this a good stir. Mainly what we're doing now is just making sure that that brown sugar gets reduced and broken down here. And that is our dipping sauce. So I mentioned this earlier, but when we started chopping that garlic, I mentioned as well that lots of times we get a little bit lazy with how we chop that garlic because it's going to come apart in the wok fry anyway, so it's not super important that we get a real nice chop on it. In today's particular instance, however, since it's going straight into this sauce raw, we do want to be very careful and make sure that we chop it properly. Otherwise, you're going to have big weird chunks of garlic floating around. Same goes for that Thai chili. All right, now we're done chopping. All right, last up, this is our vermicelli, which is right in the name, so it's very, very important. You'll see this labeled in the markets as lots of different things. Sometimes you'll see it labeled as rice sticks. I've seen that this one is labeled bean thread. Generally what we're looking for is the word vermicelli anywhere. Lots of times though I have seen the word vermicelli used to describe just plain old rice noodles, which is not what we're looking for here. That's a totally different thing. So what we're looking for, if you're still not sure, if you can't, and if it doesn't have any English on it, what we're looking for are these really, really long, thin bundles of vermicelli noodles. So you might see this packaged in a couple of different ways. Sometimes you'll see it packaged as a brick. That's not the one that we want. Sometimes you'll see it'll kind of look like a cracker. Those are the ones that you use for spring rolls and stuff because they're packaged really, really tightly, so you can just boil it and then throw it on top. and then you basically have like, it's kind of like sandwich meat, a sandwich meat layer of vermicelli rice noodle. That's not the one that we want either. We very specifically, we want the ones that are bundled like this because they come apart in the pot a little bit easier. So the other also kind of frustrating thing that you'll come across with vermicelli noodles is most of the time you'll find that they're sold in grams, which is a little bit frustrating. Sometimes, most of the time I'll find that they're sold in 500 grams, which is something like 13 ounces, like just shy of 13 ounces, which is an obnoxious number to try and buy something at, because you're going to end up with like a random errant number of like 3 pounds or 3 ounces of rice noodle kind of hanging around. So what I like to do when I buy this stuff is look for the ones that are sold in even numbers. So this is going to be 16 ounces of vermicelli noodle, which is usually a little bit extra for me. But what I do like to do and make sure when I buy this stuff is look for the one that's either sold in 8 ounces or 16 ounces. Find it and it's sold in like 500 grams or 600 grams or something like that. That's really annoying. So what I'm doing here, so this is just some boiling water that I'm pouring on top of our noodles. All of it. There we go. And then what we're gonna do is just give it a little bit of a toss. It's usually about 5 minutes or so. Is that what the French call julienne? Yeah, I believe it is what the French call julienne. It's like a julienne cup. So what we're doing here, so this is just hot water in a bowl. So a lot of times with like, more commonly with like Italian pastas, dry stuff, dry spaghetti, stuff like that, we'll use like a big old stock pot and then boiled pot of water, and then usually you'll see it like boiled for like 6 to 8 minutes, something like that. We don't want to do that in this case because it's going to be a little bit too aggressive for our vermicelli noodle, which is really, really delicate. I've even heard some folks say that lots of times that they'll just rehydrate this stuff in cold water, which is even more gentle than boiling water. That can take a while. I think it takes like 10, maybe even 20 minutes or so. I have friends that said that their job when they were kids is to just like watch over the vermicelli and then just like kind of stir it for 30 minutes. I'm not going to take that long. Also, I don't think it's necessary to be that gentle with how you cook the vermicelli, but what I like to do is just get some boiling water and then agitate for a little bit. We don't have to agitate the whole time, but we do want to agitate for the duration of time where it's still looking like raw noodles. Once it starts like sort of coming apart like it is now and sort of looks like, has the look and feel of a cooked noodle, then we're generally going to be in a good place. Also, I'm sorry that the lens cap keeps fogging up. All right. So this is generally the texture that we're looking for here. It's nice and loose. It's sort of at this point it looks like it could be a finished noodle. I know that this is not quite cooked yet. Probably needs another like 2-3 minutes. But at this point though, we can set it aside and this is gonna start cooking it on its own. Cool. One more time, hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 PST cooking new stuff. Usually, when you see me cooking something on live stream, it's going to be based off of a recipe that has already come out over on the YouTube channel. Today, we're cooking through a lemongrass vermicelli that I had done a couple of weeks ago. I think almost a month ago or so. I think more than a month ago. Those come out every Friday. So last Friday we came out with a recipe for some shumai, which is a Chinese steamed dumpling. And then this Friday coming up as the one tomorrow is going to be a crispy bacon fried rice that we like to do, and our food pop-up where we fold it inside of a burrito with some pickled shallots and cilantro crema. That's been a really fun one to do in our pop-up. So if you're looking for stuff like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check out what's going on over there. We got new recipes that are coming out every Friday. We're working our way up to 5,500 subscribers by the end of the month, and we're getting pretty close. So. Cool. All right, so there's our noodles. At this point, they should be fully cooked through. They definitely are. So I'm going to go ahead and pour this out. And that should be it. All right, last up, we're going to dive into our grilled tofu. The original recipe, as I mentioned earlier, makes use of some grilled fried chicken thigh, which is also a very, very tasty addition. Today we're using tofu because it's what I have and I want to eat tofu today. We're also sort of walking through, this is a pretty common one to be like the vegetarian option in a lot of Vietnamese restaurants. So we're going to take a look at that and sort of work our way through how to sub out chicken for tofu. The main thing that we want to pay attention to, by the way, we're rounding the corner on 30 minutes right now, which is the perfect amount of time. But the main thing that we want to pay attention to that we don't have to pay attention to when we're working with chicken is that chicken or tofu is very, very delicate. So if you are too aggressive with the way that you handle this stuff, it will start crumbling in your hands. So that's not going to be super great. So what I'm doing is I'm setting this aside, and then we have our wok heating up here. And then most traditionally, you probably would see this, as the name implies, grilled on a grill, like outdoors in a barbecue on a grill. Today, I'm not going to do that because I don't have a camera over my grill. So what we're going to do is a wok fry instead, which is, in my experience, the best way to reproduce the qualities that we're looking for in a grill is done in a wok, which I love doing because you can do a couple of different things in it. So mainly, most specifically, what I'm looking for is our wok. It has this rounded bottom here. This is very, very useful for grilling or for wok frying because what happens as we add our oil here, we're going to add a lot of it. This is probably about half a cup of oil. And then our long yao, which is basically just coating that wok in oil. And then what you'll notice is happening here is at the bottom here, all of our oil is sort of accumulating where it rounds out. That's going to be super useful because we can fry stuff in it, and some of it will even just start submerging, and it will essentially just start deep frying after that, which is very useful. So I'm adding my tofu, but I'm doing it one piece at a time. I don't want to just dump stuff in here for a couple of reasons. The number one reason that we don't want to dump that in is because our marinated also includes that lemongrass, which is 100% not edible. We don't want that lemongrass to go into our wok fry here. But also very importantly, what we want to do is make sure that when this tofu gets into the wok, that it has the largest surface area facing downward. That's because whatever part is touching the wok when it gets in is the part that's going to sear. So the more surface area that gets in contact with the wok, the more crispy tofu that we develop. Anything that's not touching the wok is not going to sear, it's just going to steam. So what we want to do is avoid stuff like this. We don't want our tofu to be sitting on top of other tofu because that's just going to start steaming, which is not ideal. So it takes maybe an extra 30 seconds or so, but what I like to do, add it one piece at a time and pay very close attention to how it's sitting in the wok. So once that's in, we can go ahead and throw away our Ziploc bag. That's a very handy part about marinating stuff in a Ziploc bag, as it makes cleaning up things real easy. So then the last and also maybe the most important part about our wok fry today is that what I like to do is just give it a little bit of a rotation. So every maybe 30-45 seconds or so, I like to give this wok a little bit of a roll like this. And that's basically just making sure that we redistribute the oil, which is a little bit of a problem, mostly a problem for the stuff that's sitting on the outside areas. So this part around here, that stuff, it doesn't quite sear as well because it's not making as much contact with that oil. So we want to make sure that we get good solid contact with all of that cooking oil here. And we do that by giving the wok a little bit of a rotation. Like so. And then finally, the most important part by far of any sear is that you have to stop touching it. So we want to make sure that we don't do any real aggressive tossing or motion. We don't want to be wok frying. We don't want to. I haven't even taken out of the spatula at this point yet. That's very intentional. We don't want to start shuffling things around because if you move stuff around too much, what will happen is things aren't going to quite sear. They're basically just going to start frying, and they're going to get like a real mediocre browning, which is not what we want. So if we want it to sear properly, stop moving it and just kind of let it sit for a little bit. When we're working in a round bottom wok like this one, you do still need to rotate it a little bit, but we want to do our best to not move it as much as possible though. Yeah. So we're going to let that go. That will probably go for another maybe 3 minutes or so, and then I think we should be ready to eat. Cool. Also, very useful part about our marinade, because it contains so much sugar. The other reason why I have added so much sugar to it is because the extra sugar, it kind of helps things sear a little bit more by adding a little bit of that extra sugar. So I do this a lot in a lot of our marinades. You'll see me adding, if not sugar, then sugary stuff like fish sauce or sweet chili sauce. Sometimes we use hoisin sauce because what happens is the sugars in those marinades, they start charring, and then we get a little bit of extra browning, which is nice. So that extra bit of fish sauce and that extra bit of brown sugar that we added, it's going to play nicely here. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to let that go. That will go for probably another 2 minutes or so. You've never had tofu before. You should definitely have tofu. Tofu is awesome. Yeah, that's been like the number one thing that lots of people ask. Like one of the big things that lots of people ask, at least, is like what to do with tofu, or like what are good versions of things to do with tofu. What always gripes me about like vegetarian versions of things is that they try and use tofu as a meat substitute, which never works. Because tofu is not meat. So you can't treat tofu in the same way that you treat meat, like chicken or beef, because it has very, very different textural qualities to it. So if you try and substitute it for meat, you're going to end up with something very bland and tasteless, because tofu doesn't taste like anything. That's the whole point of tofu. As opposed to that, there are also a lot of different things that use tofu, especially in Chinese cooking, but also in like Vietnamese and Korean cooking too. Things that use tofu that are dedicated specifically to be used for tofu. So things like mapo tofu or hong sao tofu, those are really two great Chinese recipes that are specifically designed to be using tofu and don't use tofu as a meat substitute. They use tofu like it's tofu. And that's been like one of my favorite ways of preparing tofu, or using recipes that are specifically used or intended for tofu. So I'm keeping an eye on this. I'd like to have a good idea of like timing here, but I don't, so. There you go. So mainly what I'm looking for is I'm checking the sides of our tofu. When I see it starting to brown and darken, then we're gonna give it a flip. Yeah, that's looking good. So again, just like when we put our tofu in the first time, I'm being very careful. We don't want to just go in and start tossing things around, because if we start doing wok tosses at this point, what's going to happen is it's going to start breaking up the tofu, which we don't want. So rather than do that, I'm going in and we're flipping each of these tofu one at a time. Some of which are burning. A couple of these burned. It's all right. There we go. New phone, who this? Lol. Yeah. Cool. So there's our tofu. I'm gonna let this go for maybe another minute. It will never sear it quite as well as the first side, so I have generally just given up on trying to get the second side to sear quite as well. But mainly what we wanted to do is to give it a little bit of a chance to pick up at least a little bit of color. It is, again, it's never going to get quite as crispy as the first side, so that's all right though. Generally what we're looking for is that first side to get real nice and crispy and dark. and then that second side to just pick up a little bit of solid qualities to it. At this point, by the way, if we were using chicken, we could just start tossing because the chicken is not going to pull apart or like really start crumbling or anything. For our tofu today, though, we do want to make sure we're real gentle with it, even with things like firm tofu, because it will absolutely start falling apart on us. Cool. All right. That should do it. All right, last up, as always, anytime that we're cooking in carbon steel, we want to give that wok a good rinse. Especially when we're using things that are heavy in sugar like we are today. We want to make sure and rinse that stuff out right now. If it sits and you let it sort of solidify, and then you're going to have crystallized sugar on your wok, which is not good. That's going to be really annoying to clean off. So do yourself a favor, rinse down that wok while it's still hot, and it'll come off a lot easier. Nope, camera's still not on. So real quick before we plate up, let's take a look at our tofu. A couple of these have burned because I wasn't watching it. But it is very, very aromatic. This is the sort of thing that we're looking for here. All of this really nice crispy and quality, that deep browning. That's all coming from our marinade. So let's plate this up. So first things that we're going to do here is our vermicelli noodles. What I like to do before we dive in. First thing, actually, the very first thing that what I just did is I ran this under a little bit of water. If you let these noodles sit for too long, they eventually start solidifying, and then you get kind of like a solid clump, which is not great. And then the other thing that I like to do is just go in and just give it a little bit of a chop. I usually just do that with some kitchen shears, and that will be enough. The reason that we like to do that is because the vermicelli noodles, the way that they're packed, they get really, really long, and it can be a little bit annoying to try and eat. So technically optional, but save yourself a little bit of trouble on the table trying to bite through a super long piece of noodle. Alright, so I'm starting off with my vermicelli. Then here's my tofu. I'm going to pick the ones that aren't burnt. Pretend like I didn't burn any of these. Then finally, we're going to follow up with all of our veggies. So here's my lettuce first. Followed by my julienne cucumbers. Let's separate those. And our julienne carrots. We'll put next to that. Then here's our bean sprouts. and then we're going to finish with our nokchom. This is going to be, by the way, the sauce that you most normally would see served like on the side. Sometimes if you get it to go, they'll put it in like a little plastic container on the side. And then usually the first thing that you do when you sit down to eat the food is you dump it on top, which I like to do with a spoon so that you don't just let all of it float to the bottom. So a couple of things to note. Usually lots of times when you see this served in a restaurant, lots of times I see folks will dump a whole bunch of hoisin sauce or sriracha on it, usually because it's served in a restaurant that's also serving pho. So they usually have those two things served on the side. Please don't do that. That's a terrible thing to do because of all of the work that has gone into making that nokchom. We want to try and appreciate all of those qualities. Also, we want to appreciate how fresh these vegetables are, which is very useful too. Okay, cool. Looks like I've done a little bit better job of plating this. Nah, that's all right. Cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So a couple of Fridays ago was this vermicelli rice noodle. Generally, when you see us live streaming, we're probably cooking through something that came out over on the YouTube channel already. So this particular one, in that original recipe, we did a couple of things different today. In that original recipe, we used some chicken thigh, which was super tasty. Today we did that with tofu, which is generally how you see most Vietnamese restaurants create vegetarian options for their dishes, is with tofu, grilled tofu like this. The other thing that we changed from that original recipe is that I used buttered lettuce and I left it whole because it's really pretty. It kind of just sits on the top and it's very nice plating. What's really a little bit annoying about that is that's literally just an entire piece of lettuce that's sitting in the bowl. It's kind of annoying to eat. So more commonly when you come across this stuff in a restaurant, you will probably see it like this, where it's sort of sliced super thin, and it's just a nice vegetable addition that goes on the side. So those are the main two things that we did differently. The other thing that I forgot is that I forgot to buy cilantro. I also forgot to buy peanuts, and I forgot to buy shallots. I forgot a lot of things. So vermicelli rice bowl or noodle bowl, you can see it done with a lot of different things. Very commonly, you'll see it done with like grilled chicken or grilled pork, grilled beef. Sometimes you'll see a lot of different kinds of vegetables, which are all the ones that we forgot today. So today we use some carrots, bean sprouts, lettuce, and cucumber. Very commonly you will see things like cilantro, crushed peanuts. You'll probably see things like grilled shallots. Lots of times you'll see fried shallots, like deep fried shallots. Those are really nice. All of these things very commonly you'll see come up. Eventually you have to just start picking and choosing because that's way too many things to put in one bowl. So this is what we use today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And as always, if you haven't made your way over to the YouTube channel yet, definitely hop over there and check out what's going on. We have new recipes that are coming out every Friday. So this Friday coming up as in tomorrow, we have a recipe for our fried rice burrito that's coming up, which is going to be really tasty. That's our crispy bacon fried rice that's wrapped in a burrito and topped with some cilantro crema and a pickled shallot, which is a really popular one that we serve in our food booth, which is also called Woo Can Cook. Lots of stuff like that coming up every Friday. We're working our way up to 5,500 subscribers this month. We just hit our subscriber goal at 5,000 yesterday, I think. So we're pushing that up to 5,500 this month. So as always, if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and give it a subscribe. Cool. Anyway, in the meantime, we'll be back here on Tuesday. I forget what we're cooking. So we'll be back here next Tuesday. We're going to be cooking that bacon fried rice burrito. So that's going to be a fun one. So tune in then, and we'll cook along with me. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. Bye. If you think you still don't love yourself, no. You can find it from somebody else, no. Whoa. Everybody's got to grow up. Sometimes funny how we shoot the move. Still, will we fight it, baby? Alright, never mind. Then I found what I'm looking for, baby. Yes, I found it now. Alright, I'm finally in love with love, and it's bringing me down. You want to be, baby? Yes, want to be, baby. Alright. Oh, wait, not food. I said everybody wants to be nothing. I still got streets, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got streets, but more like a took of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. You want to be, baby, yes, you want to be.
Storm love all the time. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're bad. Glass of brandy, darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time.
Coming out of